Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today on Less for Those with the Least, the implications of UK aid cuts on childhood malnutrition. And I think it's pretty fair to say that the timing of these aid cuts couldn't be worse. You know, the evidence so far suggests that COVID-19 is really accelerating existing nutritional inequalities, particularly for the most vulnerable around the world. And I think our speakers are going to take us through some of these inequalities. Um, you know, there's talk of a forthcoming hunger pandemic. So we can't say that we haven't been warned. So we have three very brilliant speakers today to take us through their both personal and professional reflections on what these cuts will mean, both at the community and child level, all the way up to the UK's ability to participate in these wider global initiatives on child malnutrition. So I'm really looking forward to the discussion today. So I'm very conscious we only have 1 hour. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome our first speaker, Dr. Saskia Osendarp. Saskia is the Executive Director of the Micronutrient Forum. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the forum, it's an international expert organization and knowledge hub on micronutrient nutrition based in the US. Now, Saskia has been a leading voice in international nutrition research over the last 2 decades. She has a wide range of experience working across the public and private sectors. She's currently a visiting associate professor of nutrition and health in low and middle income countries at Wageningen University. Welcome, Saskia.
Yes, thank you, Claire, and thank you for allowing me the opportunity to speak here today. And I'm going to speak on the work that the Standing Together for Nutrition Consortium this year did on estimating the impact that the COVID-19 crisis would have on malnutrition. And I'm going to share a few slides with you, and I hope that that works. Can you see my slides? I hope so.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
So I think the problem with the COVID-19 crisis is that it is actually 3 different shocks at the same time impacting malnutrition. Of course, there is a problem in the health system, with health systems being overburdened because of COVID, but also services being disrupted because of lockdowns. And that resulted in disruption of nutrition services, essential nutrition services, such as large-scale vitamin A supplementation to children, but multiple micronutrient supplementation to pregnant women during antenatal care, breastfeeding promotion, and the prevention and the treatment of acute malnutrition or wasting. But it is also causing disruptions in the food systems, which caused to disruptions in supplies of foods, increase in prices, and a lack of particularly nutritious foods and the availability of nutritious foods on the markets. And then finally, on top of that, there's this economic crisis that causes people to lose their jobs and incomes to fall, and that makes it even harder for people to access nutritious foods, and these nutritious foods become less and less affordable and available on the market for those who need it most. And this all affects the quality of the diets that people and children consume, as well as the health status of children, and particularly the other infectious diseases that are still prevalent in low and middle income countries that also affect their nutritional status, such as, for instance, measles or diarrhea. And all of this affects different forms of malnutrition: acute malnutrition, chronic malnutrition, micronutrient malnutrition. And we know that this will have long-lasting implications for these children and for the next generations, and costs to society, because when children are malnourished early in life, it will affect their cognitive development, it will affect their ability to do well in school, and it will eventually affect their productivity as an adult. And it will last into future generations, because these children also have a higher risk of chronic diseases later in life, and of delivering their own children with a higher risk of malnutrition. So we really are looking at intergenerational consequences here. So the Standing Together for Nutrition consortium was realizing that, first of all, that the impact of COVID on malnutrition could be horrendous. And second, because of the fact that we are talking about 3 different shocks, that we really need to work together across disciplines to estimate these impacts and to decide what we need to do to mitigate this and to build back better. So this is a collaboration between experts from the fields of nutrition, food systems, health systems, and economists that are working together to mitigate the damage of COVID-19 on malnutrition and to build back better, to come with solutions. And what did this consortium find? Well, these initial results that were published in July in The Lancet found that in 2020 alone, the combined economic impact of COVID and the disruptions that it caused in particularly the health systems would cause an additional 6.7 million children to become wasted, which is a form of acute malnutrition, a low weight for height. And that would imply an increase of 14% compared to the numbers before COVID, because we had an estimated 47 million children under the age of 5 worldwide acutely malnourished before COVID, and with an increase of 6.7 million, that number would rise to 45 million. And that's basically an increase that we haven't seen in 2 decades. And not only that these children become wasted, but we know that acute malnutrition is one of the biggest killers among children in low and middle income countries. So this consortium also estimated that this would result, that this combined impact of wasting and the disruptions that it causes in the delivery of these essential nutrition services would result in an additional 130,000 child deaths in 2020 alone. That's about 10,000 children every month that would die due to preventable malnutrition in 2020 alone. And most of these deaths would be in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, where the burdens are the highest. And that's again an increase that we haven't seen. We have in fact seen quite good progress on child deaths, since 1990. So an increase in child deaths is really a reversing of trends. And we know that this is just the tip of the iceberg, with the crisis lasting for longer and without timely action. The other forms of malnutrition will be affected as well. So we will see more stunting, we will see more micronutrient deficiencies, we will see more lives lost and more people who cannot afford a healthy diet. So with the estimates of the Standing Together for Nutrition Consortium, also a call to action was published by the 4 directors of the UN organizations, the World Food Programme, UNICEF, the FAO, and the World Health Organization. And they were calling for immediate action to prevent this from happening. And they were estimating that $2.4 billion would be needed immediately for 4 life-saving interventions, focusing on the prevention of acute malnutrition in children at risk, the treatment of acute malnutrition, to continue biannual vitamin A supplementation for children below the age of 5, and to promote breastfeeding. So what are the actions that are needed to take straight away? Well, first of all, we need to make sure that people continue to have access to nutritious, safe, and affordable diets. We need to continue to invest in improving the delivery of maternal and child nutrition services during antenatal care and during infancy and early childhood, and that needs to happen in a safe way. We need to scale up services for the early detection and the treatment of child wasting, and we need to make sure that we maintain the provision of nutritious and safe school meals for vulnerable children, and particularly where schools are closed, we need to make sure that these children receive these essential meals through other channels. And finally, we also need to expand social protection programs so that they include the access to nutritious diets and essential nutrition services. And that can be done, for instance, by adding food vouchers to these programs, or by cash transfers that enable families to buy nutritious products from the markets. So this consortium is now has now been continuing to look at what the impact of COVID-19 will mean for other nutritional outcomes and diet outcomes. So stunting, anemia, maternal anemia during pregnancy, maternal low BMI, and child mortality. And it's doing this for not only this year, but because the crisis is lasting for longer, also for the next year and the 2021 and 2022, for 3 different scenarios, because we realize that there are differences in how the economic projections for countries, and there are differences in how this crisis affects the coverage of, for instance, essential nutrition services in countries. And the consortium has been looking at costed recommendations on how to mitigate and build back better. And these findings will be released very soon, actually next week. Yeah, we will be making sure that these findings are also being given to decision makers and to people who need to make investments further in and commitments in nutrition at the Nutrition for Growth event that is scheduled for this Monday, December the 14th. And I think that's what I would like to share here about the potential impact of COVID on child and maternal malnutrition. And here are the contact details, and a special thanks to CIF, the Children's Investment Fund Foundation, who funded this work. Thank you.
Okay, Saskia, thank you for that. That was really, really interesting. And I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions. So moving on to the next speaker, I'd like to welcome Kate Monroe. Kate is the Advocacy Manager for Action Against Hunger UK. And at Action Against Hunger, her advocacy is focused on ensuring that malnutrition is a development and humanitarian priority, and her work tends to break the cycle between hunger and conflict. She has worked in the INGO sector for over a decade, and across a wide number of issues from climate change, sustainable development, conflict, hunger, and malnutrition. And Kate has recently established, she's the lead on the Action Against Hunger's first program in the UK. Welcome, Kate.
Hi, I'm great. Thanks to you, and thanks for joining. Just to follow up then on Saskia's presentation, because she's covered a lot on the current nutrition situation globally, I thought I would follow that by talking a bit more about the UK political context. And to start with, I thought it'd be useful to just put the current trends that we're seeing in historical context and look at how the UK has shown leadership on both aid and aid for nutrition in the past. So a couple of really key events in that history were the commitment to deliver 0.7% of GNI to ODA that the UK made at the Gleneagles G8 summit back in 2005. And this was supported by a major Make Poverty History campaign that called for world leaders to cut the debt burden on developing countries and increase their ODA spending. And the UK government itself was actually quite behind and supportive of that campaign because it created political space for them. So unfortunately, the UK was the only one of the G8 governments to meet the 0.7% commitment, although other governments do outside the G8. That target was met in 2013 after several years of being ramped up quite gradually. And then it was enshrined in law in 2015 under a Conservative government. And it's a commitment that has been appeared in manifestos from Labour and Conservative parties at successive elections since 2010, including the most recent election. So that seemed like a fairly secure commitment. Then alongside that, of course, we've seen the UK's commitment to aid for nutrition. And so that was first raised on the agenda in 2013, where the UK hosted the first Nutrition for Growth Summit. And that some of the political space to enable that came from the G8 summit back in 2013, where again, the UK government actually welcomed a kind of major campaign, the IF campaign that ran alongside that, calling for leadership on addressing global hunger. And then at the subsequent N4G summit, the UK committed to reach 50 million women, children and adolescents with nutrition services by 2020. And that since then has dedicated around about 4.5% of the total UK aid budget to aid for nutrition. And they've done a good job. And there was a recent kind of independent Commission for Aid Impact report, which examines how UK aid is spent. And they concluded that UK aid for nutrition warranted a green amber rating, which is a very good outcome from an ICAR review. And they also found that the UK invests well in what works on nutrition and takes a fairly evidence-based approach. But we were, even before the COVID pandemic, seeing a slight decline in UK aid for nutrition, which was a concerning trend. So this year, what we've seen, of course, is that with the impacts of COVID-19, the UK aid budget has been cut by 20%. It's actually a far steeper cut than is warranted by the decline in UK GNI, because GDP has dropped by about 11%. And that's already having a really tangible impact on the ground on country programmes for both Action Against Hunger and for many other agencies. So, for example, we work in Somalia as part of a consortium called SHINE, which is working to strengthen the health system and increase access to essential life-saving services for women and children. That programme was UK aid funded, due to run until mid next year, and is facing a 50% budget cut for the remainder of the programme period. Elsewhere in Bangladesh, where Action Against Hunger works in a consortium in Cox's Bazar, providing food security and livelihoods, wash and nutrition services for Rohingya refugees. They're facing the challenge with a complete loss of certainty in any future funding for this UK aid funded consortium. So we're now looking to other donors to kind of fill the gap that may be left by UK aid cuts. So this decision to renege on the 0.7% legislated commitment is means that the aid budget is going to be cut from £15 billion last year to £10 billion next year, which is a really steep cut of a third to try and absorb in a very short period of time, bearing in mind that the original efforts to reach the 0.7% commitment involved several years of ramping up programming. So for the government to make that cut, though, it is going to need to change the law and cut the aid budget to 0.5% of GNI, and that legislation hasn't passed yet. So there is still some opportunity there to, well, ideally actually to see Parliament stop the passage of that legislation, but failing that, there's opportunity to amend it to kind of limit some of the damage. The grounds for these cuts that the government has put forward is that the UK national debt burden is at a record high since the Second World War, following the public spending that's been necessary due to COVID-19, and also that UK GNI has dropped. But both of these arguments have really come into quite a lot of criticism because although national debt has soared, the interest rate on debt is at record lows. So the actual cost of servicing debt is almost lower than it's ever been. The decline in GNI shouldn't really be a factor because, of course, the aid budget is pegged to GNI. So if the GNI drops, the aid budget naturally drops with it. At the same time, we've seen a sharp rise in defence spending, and so the government has committed £16 billion in increased defence spending over the next 4 years, which roughly corresponds to the amount that the aid budget will be cut by. So that indicates it's rather a decision driven by political ends rather than economic need. But for now, it's unclear how long these cuts will remain in place. So coming back to our goals on UK aid for nutrition, I co-chair the International Coalition for Advocacy on Nutrition in the UK, and we have been calling for the last couple of years for the UK to renew its commitment to reach 50 million people with nutrition interventions. And this would have, if we succeed in that, it would mean that the UK spending roughly 800 million a year on nutrition programmes with at least 15% ring fence for nutrition specific interventions. We've been campaigning on this for the last couple of years with a view to the N4G summit that was meant to happen this year. And a lot of that work has been going on in Parliament. So, for example, there was a parliamentary debate, a Westminster Hall debate just this week on UK aid for nutrition that Results UK led on organising. However, of course, we are not expecting to see a major new multi-year commitment this year from the UK because the N4G summit has been postponed and also the comprehensive spending review has been postponed. So the government won't be in a position to make any kind of multi-year commitments really on any front until that spending review has taken place next year. There is the Canada Springboard event next week that the Minister Wendy Morton will be speaking at, but I don't expect that she'll make a major new financial pledge. So what are the risks, for longer term risks for UK aid for nutrition? At the moment, there's really no clarity at all from the government on where the cuts will be made. They haven't said anything on this. We do know that they want to continue to be the largest donor to the World Bank, so that's naturally going to use a substantial share of the £10 billion aid budget next year, and therefore affect bilateral spending. And we also know that they've identified 6 priority areas, which includes climate and biodiversity, global health, science, research, technology, conflict, and humanitarian response. So all of these in different ways, of course, intersect with nutrition. And they're also committed to focus on countries where UK economic security and development interests align, which includes sub-Saharan Africa. And that's, I mean, yeah, that's really part of a long-term trend with UK aid, is increasingly pegging it to UK national interests. A positive trend with the merger of DFID and FCO is that the FCDO will now manage over 90% of the aid budget, which is a lot more than DFID was set up to manage, as increasingly UK aid has been spread across government departments. We've also seen a rise in UK aid for health, which is welcome. However, that is largely going into major, into Communicable Disease Act global initiatives, particularly vaccine initiatives. And we've seen big cuts, unfortunately, to health coverage and universal health coverage and health systems strengthening investment. However, there is some hope for nutrition because it has a very strong evidence base behind it, and we know that the government likes to make commitments based on evidence of what works. And Dominic Raab has indicated privately to MPs that he would see the UK making a significant commitment next year, and it's an area that he would support investing in. It also has political support from parliamentarians, and we've also got the government has recently appointed a new special envoy on humanitarian affairs and famine prevention, Nick Dyer, which is some indication of their commitment to action on famine. Although his remit is much more focused on diplomatic rather than aid efforts. So just finally, I wanted to close on highlighting a few opportunities for next year, advocacy-wise. So firstly, of course, the legislation to repeal the 0.7% commitment hasn't passed yet, and there is still opportunity to both oppose that legislation and to call for amendments. So there is a big cross-sector initiative to work with parliamentarians to try to resist that change. And there's a lot of opposition within Parliament from both Conservative and opposition benches. So there's still hope there that we can limit the damage, even if not completely prevent the legislation from passing. The government has also approved maintaining the International Development Committee in Parliament, which is the scrutiny committee for UK aid, which would naturally have disappeared when DFID was merged with FCO, but there's such strong parliamentary support for maintaining the committee that the committee will survive. So that's a really useful accountability body. Then, of course, next year the UK will again be hosting a G7 summit, and this time it will be the first time that in this millennia where a UK hosted G7 and G8 summit doesn't necessarily have the UK playing a really ambitious leading role on global development cooperation at its heart. But global health and food security and nutrition will be major agenda items. So there is opportunity there to try to inform the agendas and the commitments that leaders make at the G7. And then, of course, at the end of the year, there's the postponed N4G summit, and that will follow the comprehensive spending review. So it will be a time when the UK is potentially in a position to make a new multi-year pledge. Then finally, next year, there's also the Food Systems Summit in France, and there's a climate change conference of the parties that the UK will be hosting. So that's another chance to call for an integrated approach to climate change and nutrition and promotion of nutritious, sustainable diets. So yes, as a final point, I just want to say that if for anybody working in this space, it's in the meantime really critical to keep communicating the story about both the level of rising needs and the impacts of UK aid cuts.
Kate, thank you very much for that. Thank you. And our final speaker is Ben Dayton. He's the managing editor of SciDevNet. And this SciDevNet, for those of you who don't know, is the biggest news service covering science in a developing global development context. Ben is responsible for overseeing content, ensuring editorial independence and the quality of articles and multimedia products. And I'm sure you would all join me, those of you familiar with SciDevNet, and saying, Ben, it's a really great platform. So Ben joined SciDevNet in July 2017 after 4 years as editor of Horizon Magazine. He's also worked as a journalist since 2001, and he's been a reporter for Reuters in London and Brussels. Welcome, Ben.
That's great. Many thanks, Claire, for giving me the chance to talk about this important subject. I'd like to really add some details to Kate's presentation, which looked at the potential impact of cuts, and give you our understanding as a news organization of what these cuts are likely to entail and what we're seeing on the ground. As we've heard, they come at a very difficult time. Obviously, the world's suffering from COVID. People in poor countries need us more than ever to help strengthen food systems. And also, as you've heard, there's currently very little clarity about where these cuts will fall, what the impacts of the cuts will be. And so from our position, what we've heard that FCDO has been requesting and approaching grant recipients to compile lists of subcontractors, and we understand that's because they're trying to understand the downstream impact of cuts and to work out where the impact will be greater or less. Of course, we've heard that nutrition remains a priority, and in the famous letter to Sarah Champion, Dominic Raab put as his second priority area global health security, which entails major investments in global initiatives, core funding to the WHO, and support for fragile health systems. And of course, nutrition is a critical part of that. We also understand that nutrition has been given its own thematic platform within the Gilbert Fund, the 1 billion Gilbert Fund, which is still in the pipeline. It's not confirmed yet, but that's reassuring. As we heard, that the International Development Committee are currently scrutinizing these cuts. The Foreign Secretary will be giving his evidence in January. There is still time to for changes to that, but how much the dial can be shifted is really very unclear. From talking to our networks and contacts, we believe that these cuts are going to be focused on long-term research, research which doesn't generate immediate results. Social science is potentially particularly at risk. Research looking at the wider factors that contribute to malnutrition and stunting, things such as governance and conflict. All of these areas are slightly out of the main topics that people recognize, that the general newspaper reading public is aware of, and that puts them at risk. And that's really the problem? Because, and it's something that we're looking into at SciDevNet. We're hoping to produce more stories on and so investigations. So you can check us out, scidev.net. You'll be able to read about it. But of course, the main thing is that research is needed to document problems and identify solutions. And for example, the growing importance of food systems approaches, taking into account nutrition and environment. These are all sort of long-term research topics, things that are slightly, out of the headline-grabbing research. And once a problem has been identified, then there's still a huge challenge in implementation, and research is needed for that. And that's something which, again, isn't in the sort of Daily Mail reading newspapers reality. A recent paper by Jeff LeRoy from IFPRI, published in the American Journal of Public Health, found that of the 97% of grants studied, of all the grants they studied, 97% were aimed at developing new technologies which could reduce child mortality by 22%. But this reduction is the third of what could have been achieved, what could be achieved if existing technologies are fully utilized. It really underlines that that work of understanding how to apply solutions is really critical, and really something that we feel is particularly at risk from these cuts. There's also the geographical spread, and we've heard how the UK is going to be focusing its aid spending on countries that have a sort of a tactical priority for the UK, and that's likely to be to the detriment of many middle-income countries, where, as we know, nutrition is a huge problem. Countries such as India, for example. And there's also the fact that women and girls are likely to be the ones who suffer the most from these reductions. For example, in their role in smallholder farming, and that's something which is really a shame, and really it would be really good to fight against. Girish Menon, the head of ActionAid, said recently, the reality is that tens of thousands of lives could be lost as a result of these cuts. These cuts will be felt hugely by the world's poorest, but will make very little difference to the public purse. And we heard already about the low interest rates and the almost incremental impact of these cuts for the UK budget, yet the massive impact for people in poor countries. In terms of SDG 2, already the situation has been getting worse, and COVID has accelerated that. And we've been hearing about value chains, food value chains breaking down, with national lockdowns, and it makes the fact that these cuts come at really the very worst time, and which we heard when Saskia mentioned that. And on top of that, there's also a concern that many donor countries will follow the UK in making these cuts. I mean, all countries in the global north have spent massive amounts of money trying to prop up their economies, and there'll be political pressure for them to balance their books, to rebalance their books, and so it's very likely that we'll be seeing funding scale back across the donor countries. And one of the problems with nutrition research is that its importance to topics like education, food security, and health is often poorly understood by the general public. And so it means that big ticket topics are better positioned to weather cuts, in our opinion, than more specific research which people don't understand, the general public doesn't understand. And as Kate said in her presentation, funding for nutrition research was already falling. So, the challenge, as we've heard, is to really underline the role that nutrition plays. And we hope to be doing that through our own reporting. And just before I finish, there's one more thing I promised my team I would mention, that we're running a debate ourselves looking at how to tackle vaccine hesitancy as the COVID vaccination programs get underway. The debate's live on SciDevNet from 2:30 p.m. a week from now, next Thursday, December the 17th. So please dial into that. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you for that. So we've had 3 really great presentations today, and I'm going to kick off with the chair's prerogative, and I'm going to ask each of you to tell us, the research community, what should we do? What can we do? What should we do from your different perspectives? Maybe start with you, Saskia.
Yes, well, what we should do is we should be speaking more to others, and not among ourselves, but to others about the potential impacts that we see happening due to COVID, but also before COVID, and not only that it is. I mean, it's a problem for these children, but we really run a risk of losing an entire generation. And I think because we know that these children, when they are malnourished early in life, that this will affect their ability to do well in school and to develop into productive adults. And I think we cannot really run that risk. And it's also going to affect us, because every dollar that we invest in nutrition, that's another data point that we have, will give us $16 in return. So I think we will need to continue to collect data and demonstrate that this is actually happening, and also to continue to come up with, we do have solutions in nutrition, but for instance, there's a lot of areas where we don't have solutions, or not as clear cut as we do, for instance, in essential nutrition services. So food systems, we really need to come up with, okay, what are the most efficient interventions across the food systems that we can apply. And then finally, what we also realized when we were doing our research on the impact of COVID on all forms of malnutrition, it's just simply not possible at this stage to give a full picture because of lack of data. And I think we need to stress that to governments, that we need to have more data, also for them to spend their money wise, and especially when budgets are cut, which of course we all hope will not happen, but when budgets are cut, it's important that we get the most nutrition out of the budget that we have. And for that, we need to have data on, for instance, not only stunting and wasting, but also micronutrient deficiencies and obesity in low and middle income countries, which is a rising problem, but we don't really know in many contexts what the problem really is. And I think that we need to give that message over and over again and speak with others about this. And yeah, that's the message that I have.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. Kate?
I guess you're just on that data point. I suppose particularly this year, a real challenge is that it's in many countries not feasible to do nutrition surveys because of social movement restrictions related to COVID-19. And so certainly that's been a real challenge for Action Against Hunger. And it's a big concern that lack of data in itself is like a mandate to cut nutrition spending. If we don't have clear baseline evidence of malnutrition in Northeast Nigeria, how do you know how much you need to invest in meeting needs? Yeah, I suppose, I mean, that the challenge of the commission, it's for the research community, as it is for the operational NGO community, will be to really communicate the story of, even notwithstanding those data problems, rising malnutrition, because currently, of course, like, you know, the context in which these cuts are being able to be pushed through is the fact that the media landscape is really oriented towards the domestic space, and we need to kind of get broadly development concerns, but in particular nutrition, on the media agenda. And we also need to have a kind of collaborative approach to really communicating the challenges to parliamentarians too. So I think more collaboration between NGOs and the research community on telling the story would be helpful.
Thank you. Ben?
So really to echo that mantra of communication, particularly from our point of view as a media organization, communicate to us, talk to us and our colleagues. The public need to understand why nutrition matters why nutrition for people in poor countries matters to them.
Yeah.
And it does matter, it's hugely important. And it's just a case of really communicating that in a way which is meaningful to the general newspaper reading public. And outside of net, we kind of sit in between as a sort of at the interface between the research community and the general media. We write about science, but we write about science in a way that's meaningful to a general reader. So us or any of our colleagues, just keep keep press releases and research papers coming, keep notifying us if you think that there's something which would be of interest to our readers, and just keep telling the story.
Great, thank you. So just opening it up to the audience, do we have any questions?
I have a question. I think it's probably most for Kate. So now that the aid budgets will be cut and they say it will be only for 1 year, and then now it's also the reduction in GDP, and that one is expected to sort of grow again next year. How do you, just from your program's perspective, how do you deal with so much uncertainty in funding?
I think it's a real challenge, and it varies a lot by context. So, for example, in Bangladesh, in Cox's Bazar, there are other donors supporting our programs there too, who we can turn to. So, in the face of, like, prospectively a UK aid funding consortium program being cut, there, other donors may be able to step in and plug the gap. In other countries, though, it's there aren't necessarily other donors around that can fill the gap. So, as in Somalia, which I mentioned, really the UK has been a critical leading donor in supporting the strengthening of the Somali health system, and there aren't necessarily any other donors out there who are doing the same thing on the same scale. So it simply means cutting the budget substantially and therefore cutting back services. But where those cuts end up being made are often not the kind of headline grabbing stuff. So, you know, clinics, the frontline clinics that provide the immediate sort of life-saving treatment for child malnutrition, some of them will survive. Those would be the kind of priority to maintain. But what gets cut is the work to, say, train and capacity strengthening work for the health sector, and the work to kind of coordinate different actors in the health sector. It's stuff that doesn't make for good newspaper stories, but actually is really critical for long-term health system strengthening. And that's what I guess in the longer term we might see more and more being cut, which is a real pity, because actually that can be where aid can make the biggest difference.
Thank you. Actually, Saskia, I wanted to ask you about this 2.4 billion. Now, is that in place, coming? You know, what's the kind of state of that, and when will that come online?
Yeah, so I think that's the that was what was in the call to action that the four directors of the UN were referring to, which was their estimates of what was needed immediately for these life-saving to scale up these life-saving actions to prevent basically a disaster from happening. And as was indicated by Kate, this year, unfortunately, also all these pledging commitments moments have been postponed due to COVID. So we were supposed to have the Nutrition for Growth event in the summer, and didn't happen. So it's uncertain what will come, you know, from this 2.4 billion. And this is of course not a discussion that's only ongoing in the UK, unfortunately. And I think that's also why it's so important. As what Ben said, to make the case on why nutrition and why not, you know, with all these other emergencies coming up now. But I think I don't know whether we already have anything on this 2.4 billion. I do think that there are definitely a lot of efforts going on in countries themselves. So governments of countries have stepped up efforts to prevent, to safeguard basically the access to nutrition services, to restore these. Also, there has been massive investments in social protection programs in countries. But of course, the scale of this problem is so large that and that this will be running out. We also now have these financial projections of what happens, with ODA, and that's always lagging a bit behind. We know that if there's that means that 2 years down the line, ODA will still go down just because of a result of this economic crisis here. So there is only so much that governments from countries themselves can do.
Okay, thank you for that. Shireen, do we have any questions coming up on the chat?
I have a question that I would like to ask, if I could use my privilege here just for a second. Today is International Human Rights Day, and the UN broadcast a statement from Michelle Bachelet talking about how human rights violations affect us all, not just the people on the receiving end of it. We in LIDC had an event this morning where we were supporting the 16 Days Against Gender-Based Violence campaign. And one of the central tenets of that campaign is that violence against women and girls is a human rights violation. So my question is kind of twofold. The first part of it is there scope for campaigning on the increased likelihood of child malnutrition as a violation of rights? And also, how much pressure can be exerted on the UN to raise this in relation to SDG 2, which is zero hunger? So sorry, that was a bit of a convoluted question. I was trying to get it to make sense, so I hope it did. Thank you for letting me ask it.
I think to your answer on is this a human rights issue, absolutely, of course. Good nutrition is in fact established as in the children's rights. So children have a right for good food, so that they can develop to their full potential. So yes, if we derive children from their rights to good nutrition, that's a violation of human rights, definitely. And what we have learned is that, unfortunately, that's not always an argument that makes people change their mind, but there is an economic argument and a social security argument that is to be made here as well. And the economic argument is, of course, the longer lasting impacts that it will have on countries' GDP eventually down the line, because these children will not live to their full potential, so they will not be as productive, and they will not contribute to GDPs. And of course, that's in the end then an impact that will also affect countries across the world, because we are a global economy now. And then there's a security impact, is that we've seen that hunger has often been the root cause of conflict and of all issues around refugees and migration streams. So I think that these type of arguments are often more appealing even than the human rights issue, which I would think is appealing enough in itself. And children should just not have to die before they are 5 years of age. I mean, that's just horrific that we continue to let that happen. And this is, every single child is one too many. So today, the World Food Programme obviously received the Nobel Peace Prize, which I think was a very right decision of the committee this year. And David Beasy just said this morning when he was receiving the prize, he said, well, I'm going to bed not thinking about those children that we saved, but I'm going to bed weeping for those that we didn't save. And I think that's exactly the issue. I mean, every single child that dies of malnutrition is one too many.
Thank you very much. we have a great question from Anthony Vallion. So Anthony, if you're still there, would you like to unmute your microphone, preferably use your camera if you don't mind, to voice your question?
Hello, thank you, Shireen. Thank you, everybody. The question I had is going back into the 1990s. I was in the United States, and there was a survey done, which was quoted by the United Nations Association of the USA, around the ODA targets of 0.7, and also the perception in the United States of how much the US government put in aid in terms of aid spending. And I was wondering what people in the UK are aware of in terms of, is there anything similar? So what they found was that the 0.7% target was, the US was achieving about 0.3%, but many people in the public averaged it out at around about 30%. So people thought 30% of the US government was going to overseas aid, but it was really 0.3. But they also found that the 0.7% target itself was misunderstood, and people often thought that was 7% of the budget rather than 0.7. So it may be easier to sell 1%. I think there was a campaign for one campaign a while ago, but it seems that a 1% target may be an easier one than a 0.7 if the 0.7 is seen as 7% of the government budget. 1% may be an easier sell. Also, with the military targets of NATO, countries are expected to spend 2%. So if perhaps we might be able to argue for a 1% for aid as a simple target when there's a 2% for the military, perhaps that might be an easier sell. So I was wondering if any on the panel had heard anything similar around UK public perceptions, what people actually think compared to how much is actually being spent, and whether they're aware of any case for 1% or another way in terms of, because the new government target is 0.5, so I know it will be a doubling, but maybe in the public's mind of many, perhaps the people not so good on maths or not thinking very clearly, 1% may be easier than 0.7 to sell. Thank you.
I don't really have, just to say that the really unfortunate situation in the UK, as you know, is that we have a government, a right-wing conservative government who the policies are designed to appeal to the people who read the Daily Mail. I don't know if people think that we spend 7% on aid. It really wouldn't surprise me. Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's a great idea to highlight the fact that it's double the amount on defence as it is on aid. It just, I think, comes back to that issue of telling stories. And, you know, if people really could understand the impact of aid and really see what it means and what it means to them, then perhaps we can change that. So that's just a sort of big picture answer. I can't answer you on the specifics.
Okay, do you have anything to add, or?
Not loads. I think there's there's been a lot of surveys over the years in the UK monitoring public views of attitudes to aid, and tended to find a similar kind of picture in that people perceive our national aid budget to be greater than it really is, and are often surprised that it's only 0.7% of GNI. Yeah, often those surveys, how much support you get for aid really depends on how you frame the question. Like if you ask the question, should we spend money on treating children at home or abroad, then children at home will, dealing with food crisis amongst home or abroad, the domestic spending always wins out. But if you ask people whether we should cut the aid, whether the aid budget should be 0.7% of GNI, people might say yes, thinking that it's currently much higher than that and not realising that's actually what it is. It's a very difficult political climate right now to actually be calling for an increase in the aid budget when it's been years of campaigning just to get to the 2015 point when the 0.7% commitment was enshrined in law, and now of course the government wants to renege on it.
Okay, thank you. We have a question from Francesca. Francesca, do you want to unmute?
Hi, Kate. I mean, I feel like you've almost partially answered my question, because this summer we had a massive campaign to try and continue school meals over the break, and the government here in the UK, I mean, I'm sorry, I'm very Eurocentric at the moment, here in the UK, and they cut the funding nationally. It's going to be even harder to try and get any kind of international support if they're not even funding or caring about hunger in a national level.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting point. I guess for me, because I've actually been involved with Action Against Hunger in trying to establish our first UK programme. So we're working with community organisations in the UK that are meeting essential food needs for really low income communities. And so it's interesting to kind of learn a bit about the UK picture as well as the global picture. And I guess the frustration for me, it's always just like why these things have to be played off against each other. It's not hungry people in the UK versus hungry people in Somalia. Like, our defence budget has shot up, our national debt interest rates are lower than ever, inequality is soaring, there's been more billionaires created this year. There was lots of places to get the money from without having to trade off the idea that poor people in the UK are up against poor people elsewhere.
Yeah, thank you. I think we're going to have to kind of wrap up now. And I think the nutritional community is quite polarized, and the nutritional research community is even more polarized. And although that there's a variety of these global kind of constructs, and these are very, very important, individual researchers often feel powerless in the face of such great change and the daunting prospect of what's now happening in terms of global malnutrition. And one of the things that I think is really important is that we have to stop thinking of global malnutrition as a wicked problem that we cannot address. It's a tame problem. We have the solutions. And as Ben mentioned, we have solutions that are on the shelf that can be used. As Saskia mentioned, it is, there are ways, we have been making improvements. There are some positives out there, but we have to stop thinking that we can't address this. And I think, as Kate, you've given us a call to action. It's not enshrined yet. It's not over. We can collaborate, we can cooperate, we can move together to try to change this. And so I want to thank my speakers very much. And before we leave, please, if you have one key point that you want our audience to remember, please can you tell us now? And I guess I'll start with you, Saskia. Oops, you're muted.
Yeah, the one key point is that this is not the time to cut down on investments in nutrition, because we really run a risk of losing an entire generation.
Okay, thank you. Kate?
I've kind of said it already, but yeah, as you say, it's not over yet. I mean, although all the signs are negative, the legislation hasn't passed, so there's still time to keep communicating the story about rising needs and the impacts of cuts. So really, we need to be doing that collectively.
Yeah, thank you. And Ben?
Just to say again, tell us your story. Let's hear about, what research is doing, and let's tell everybody and cover it and promote it, and just get people aware of exactly all the good work that's going on and the great need that there is out there.
Great. What an interesting panel you've been, and I thank you so much for your time today. You've been absolutely brilliant, and we hope that this is the start of the conversation, and we'll certainly keep you abreast of changes or anything that we can do at LIDC, and we hope that we can keep the conversation going. So thank you very much to our speakers. Thank you to our audience. Thanks for the great questions. And yeah, we really appreciate your time.